Hey everyone, I'm Mary Beth McAndrews from Dread Central, and I'm here today with Adam Robitel, director of Taking of Deborah Logan, the Escape Room movies, Insidious 4. Hello, I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
So, we're chatting today because you're in the horror crowd, and I wanted to hear first off how you got involved in the documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I've known Ruben for quite a while. I think I met Ruben up at Lynn Shay's house one day, and just kind of fell in love with his passion. And he was just such a sweet guy, and he really hustles, and he knows everybody. And James Wan was there that day, and so yeah, it was a kind of kismet. And
What a cool party! You just hanging out with
I
Lynn
know,
Change.
I know. Well, it's true. I mean, but it never, it always just feels like super fun and low key. And she always, she's always puts out this and cool, amazing food. And but it is like a little refuge from the LA experience, and it's all. People from all walks of the horror space, and whether they're directors or just fans. I mean, she just brings an eclectic group of people together. So it's been really cool.
That's so cool. So I am curious, how did you first get introduced to horror movies in general? Like when you were younger, like what was your entry into the genre?
I always say like I was raised with really, really scary ghost stories. I was really close to my grandmother, and she used to scare the hell out of us as kids
I
with.
was going to ask about that in the documentary. You talked about your grandma's scary stories, so I was curious about those.
Yeah, look, I mean, she grew up Catholic, and I'm
Oh,
recovering Catholic, but
same.
I mean, the biggest one was in the '70s. They had a version of a Ouija board. It was called the Zariah board, and I have cousins who are like grown vice presidents of corporations who just won't talk about that time now, and it was over a 7 year period, and you have to understand, like, it was a really scary kind of lake house in the middle of nowhere, and the entity in the board became quite volitionally powerful, and it just knew preternatural things, like things that like my cynical grandfather on the other side just didn't believe it, and he said, okay, if that thing's real, what was my war buddy's name in Guam? And it spelled out Phish, fish. And he just went blanche white and left the house and never went back to my grandmother's house. And but then it started to get really biblical and crazy, and it had violent commands it wanted people to do. And so my grandmother's telling me this stuff, and then she's like, "Oh, and then it physicalized itself." We said, "Where is Sheba?" Sheba was her collie dog that had just died, and all of the logs felt like 20 people saw this in the fireplace, fell down into the perfect shape of a collie dog. You know what I mean? So she's telling
What?
me that these yeah, she's telling me these stories at 10 years old, and she's like, okay, good night. And so I was indoctrinated to the supernatural, and she had had a lot of psychic experiences, and she just adamantly, and she wasn't like burning sage and doing all this weird stuff. She was a very grounded, very smart lady, but she just had the spiritual side to her. Like when her best friend Marie died, she talked frankly with her what it was going to be like to pass, and she said, will you visit me if you can? I will if I can. I'm going to be busy, is what Marie said in her deathbed. And then Marie passed away, and then my grandmother in the middle of the night woke up, and this old defunct television had started to glow. And she got out, and she has polio, so she couldn't walk, but she got up on her stool and looked, and there was no moonlight. It was only when she acknowledged, that's you, Marie, did the light go away. And so I was open to that kind of stuff early on. And by the way, like, the house had to be blessed in tongues. The Catholic Church ended up burning the board, and it wouldn't burn. You know what I mean? So like, so by the time I saw which board, I was like, oh yeah, Malfader, of course, because we had one of those. And so yeah, and early on, I just, like a lot of the kids of the '80s would go and steal, like, not steal, but like we would rent rated R movies from West Coast Video, and it was like the Silent Night, Deadly Nights, and the Friday the 13th, and watching a whole bunch of stuff we shouldn't have watched at that age, and I was just hooked. I just so yeah. Sorry for the long-winded
No,
answer.
I love that though. I like that you both watched horror movies, but then like had your grandmother living a horror movie, and you're like, I
Oh
don't need to
yeah,
watch anything else. Like it's too real.
for sure. Yeah, for sure. And New England is an older part of the country.
Oh,
There's a
New England.
lot of a lot of ghost stories, and just a lot of, we had a cousin who lived in the Cape, and a group of people saw like what they described as a witch come running up from their basement and run right out of the house, and they discovered later that there was a gravestone underneath the backyard, and so like things like that where you're like, what? You didn't check those records? What?
That wasn't in like the property listing or anything.
Right. And now I like, I haven't had a psychic experience. Like, I'm waiting for my grandmother to show me a sign, and I'm a little verklempt that she like ostensibly hasn't, but I'm still open to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I want to believe. And
Yeah.
so I think making movies and steeping in that kind of stuff helps me deal with the dread of existence.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. What was the first horror movie you ever saw? Do you remember?
The first movie that really, it wasn't a horror movie, but I think it really viscerally affected me was E.T. because it was so
Oh,
emotionally upsetting. It's not a horror movie, but it had that effect on me, and I cried and sobbed, and I couldn't understand. I think
it
Jaws.
scared me as a kid. I couldn't watch it
Oh
again.
yeah.
It was too much. Like it was just the ending was just way too much. Like dead ET on the side. Like that was just
Oh
too
my,
much for my kid heart to understand.
for sure, for sure. And like, look, I think it was all the classics. I mean, I certainly, the Friday the 13th movies really screwed me up because I grew up on a lake in New Hampshire, and just the woods were always kind of creepy, and so I
Yeah.
think Friday the 13th. I mean, by the time I had seen The Exorcist, there was so much build up to it, and I found it kind of almost amusing in a way. But yeah, like The Omen definitely ruined my mind
Yeah.
for a while. And yeah, Nightmare on Elm Street certainly gave me a lot of nightmares. They had a show called Freddy's Dreams, I think,
Oh
or
yeah.
Freddy's Nightmares,
Yeah, yeah.
and that used to really scare me as a kid. So yeah, and it's always been, I mean, Silent Night, Deadly Night just destroyed Christmas for me.
Fair. Fair.
you know,
Yeah.
Rawhead Rex was another one I just remember with all my cousins watching that, and it's like, wait, is he peeing on that guy's head? What is happening?
I just
Um,
watched that for the first time recently and was like, what
did you
is
really?
yes.
It's the novella is amazing, and Barker gets into like all the baptismal stuff, and
Yeah.
look, it's a hard creature to pull off at that budget, and they did a valiant effort with that.
I was impressed for what it was. I was impressed. But so Taking of Deborah Logan is one of my favorite found footage movies. I am a huge found footage person, so this is one of the ones I kind of try to push people towards when they are not as sure about found footage. And so I wanted to hear more about what drew you to first the technique of found footage. I know it's a lower budget way of making horror films. I know that's very appealing, but I wanted to kind of hear more about why you wanted to make a movie using that technique, especially as like your first feature.
Yeah, I look. I had written a western that I wanted to. I had written a script called The Bloody Benders that Guillermo del Toro had optioned, and I thought like, oh my god, like the master himself has deigned me a screenwriter, and like suddenly, like I'm gonna work for the rest of my life. And I found myself waiting for 2 years and going, oh shit. And I never wanted to direct, but it was just one of those things where I was like, okay, I'm sitting around. I don't like writing that much. It's really hard for me. I'm good at it, but it's very mentally crushing. So
Yeah.
how can I go make a movie? And yeah, found footage it was just as you say, it was an efficient, cost efficient way to make a show, but it was also, I had had a lot of documentary experience and a lot of editing experience
Oh,
before
cool.
that. So it was like a way to jump into making a movie without making a real movie in a way. And then I started kind of going down this road of like, okay, what scares me? And I had an uncle who had Alzheimer's. I remember just stories of, he fell out of a second floor window, and broke his back, and people would find him in people's yards, and it was always just terrifying to me. This we're ticking time bombs genetically, and so that was a. And then I started doing research, and I watched the Maria Shriver documentaries. And I remember distinctly watching a Nightline episode, and it was this poor woman who's 50 years old, and she had early onset Alzheimer's. Okay. And she was talking quite lucidly. She was in mild cognitive impairment. So she was writing down notes on mirrors and stuff to try to stave off her memory slips. And then it cut to her a year later, and she was the color of your shirt. She didn't recognize her husband, her daughter. She was in an adult high chair at that point, and I was I still get goosebumps
I'm
because
getting
like, what?
goosebumps right now from you just
Yeah,
describing, like, that is horrible.
and I was like, okay, imagine this as a way in for a documentary, but and everybody for the first half of the movie, you think it's a medical documentary, but there's something else going on, and 1 out of 1,000 dementia cases are a parasitic entity of some type. So that was the initial kind of way in. And then, yeah, it was just, I hit the ground running. A lot of my grandmother's DNA in terms of Deborah and being a proud woman who was self-sufficient and had her own
Okay.
business and the answering service, like all that stuff was my grandmother's kind of imprimatur, in terms of the character. And yeah, and so it kind of permutates into and it was really tricky to crack in terms of like the structure. And my co-writer Gavin Heffernan, who I was working on it for like 6 months and couldn't crack it. Initially, it was like a hybrid found footage slash scripted version of a movie, and he just said like embrace the found footage. And we learned a lot, because you have to really validate why people are filming, and that becomes like if you don't believe the world, if you don't believe why they're filming, if a priest walks in and says, your daughter's possessed by the devil, like you don't want to be shooting it straight on. You want to be through a window and through a screen and have
Yeah.
subtitles. And so we really embraced it. And I still feel like found footage, when it's done well, is way scarier because you are allowed to kind of just go that extra foot of like, is this real? And you'd be amazed. I mean, we were brought in to rewrite Paranormal Activity 5,
I
and
was going to ask about that.
well, we were so cynical by that point, and they had been shooting for a year, and the movie was in rough condition. But like, I guess my point is like when we started to do like marketing stuff, and you see the feedback, and people still think it's real. Like and you just walking around a room, and people just so the language of found footage is very effective when it's done well.
I oh, I very much agree. I have a Blair Witch Project tattoo and a Noroi tattoo.
Awesome, Ellie
Obsessed with.
Kedward for life.
Yes, exactly. And I was so. What are some of your favorite found footage films? I mean, Blair Witch Project aside, I'm assuming is obviously like the pinnacle.
Yeah, well, I saw Blair Witch. What's amazing is a friend of mine, just a bunch of friends, and he popped a VCR. It had just come from Sundance, and nobody knew what it was. And so I saw Blair Witch as like, hey, dude, you guys have to see this. This shit's real, and pop right into the VCR. And it definitely really influenced me. Frankly, the Curse of the Blair Witch, which is this companion marketing piece that arguably,
Documentary on the sci-fi
yeah,
documentary. Yeah.
it's so good because it gets into the historical records, and it gets into they really got it right. And in fact, I no shame on the sequels, but I just the verisimilitude was so powerful in the first movie. So that one definitely influenced me. In terms of other found footage movies, certainly the first Paranormal was exciting, and it was a
Yeah.
new kind of idea. And I'm trying to think of other ones that have really, Lake Mungo is certainly a beautiful movie. Yeah, and a lot of the like I would go to documentaries first before found footage. I mean, look
Okay.
when Cloverfield came out, that was obviously a bigger, more robust budget. Chronicle, again, another really well done. The kid is being abused by his father, so it's like he's filming his father to kind of to protect himself. And the movies that do well are they emotionally, you understand the emotional reason for filming.
Yeah. Cool. And so we talked about how found footage is a lower budget way of making horror, but you do have some pretty awesome special effects moments. I mean, we all know the moment at the end with the snake and the unhinged jaw, which is like one of the coolest kills. So what was it like to kind of balancing low budget kind of DIY filmmaking aesthetics while also integrating these moments of special effects that deliver these scares? Like what is that
Yeah.
kind of balance like and making sure they all go together cohesively?
Well, the first part of that equation is amazing, amazing, amazing actors,
Yeah.
and Jill Larson, she was such a trooper, but she's such a sweet person. She never watched a horror movie in her life. But when she came in for that audition, there were a lot of gals, a lot of women who could do the sort of grandma slipping into dementia, and then there were some that could be really scary, but there was only one that could do both. And when Jill's eyes turned in the audition and she leaned forward, and all of the producers backed up, like you know, you could feel the visceral fear in the room. I was like, oh my god, this is her, this is she, you know. So I have to give credit to Jill first. Because a lot of the movie is just little sleights of hand and sound design and little bumps, and you know, we do things that you know, you move the camera and suddenly something's moving in the frame, or you
Yeah.
catch a whisper of her walking past the doorway. But we always knew at the end, I wanted one shot that people were going to talk about, because I knew I wasn't going to have any marketing for the movie. And I always say, like, you know, it's not the image anymore, it's the context, meaning we start in a very grounded space, which is like medical diagrams and hospice and hospitals. And so by the time you're in that mind and you're like, well, what was that? You're not ready for it. You know what I mean? And and so it was always intended to be, because if I had done that from the beginning, Snake Lady from the beginning, it would have been like, okay, 10 minutes into the movie, you're bored of it, you know? And so it was very intentionally kind of drawn out to get to that point. And, you know, we tried to do it practically, did not work. We had this ridiculous looking prosthetic baleen shark thing that we pushed our sweet gal who worked in our office into on like a sliding ramp, and it just looked so weird and bad. And I was kind of devastated, but we ended up getting a company, Soho Effects, out of Canada to do us a solid. And so we ended up reshooting that. And so what they did was they did a facial mapping of Jill. And it was a very expensive shot to have in a little movie, but they just crushed it, you know. And
It looks incredible. Like, I thought it was practical at first. So I mean,
yeah, and it was so funny. You know, we also just had such a great time on that movie. It's the best movie. It's the most fun still. It's the movie I'm most proud of, because frankly, we wrote it, and escape room movies and stuff. You know, I guided them, but I didn't write them. And but at its core, it's a mother-daughter story, and I think that's the reason so many people, you know, responded to it, was because of that relationship, and that Sarah is a lesbian, but she wasn't. It wasn't just tokenism. She was a real person, you know, who you could feel that she had struggled with addiction herself, and that she was just really grounded. And Anne Ramsey was incredible too. And but like, you know, we would be in the mine, and like Jill would have a snake on her, and then we would finish a take, and they would just fall on the floor, just dying laughing. And it was just, you know, and what was amazing too, in retrospect, is like, we had a really small crew, but they could feel that there was something special happening, that the actors were bringing their A game. And so it was just, everybody was really working for the cause. And that's when making a movie becomes really magic, is that everybody wants to be there, and they all want to serve this one thing that we're trying to do.
that's amazing. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, going from obviously this lower budget found footage movie to making movies like the Insidious film, but also Escape Room and Escape Room 2, what was that like to direct sequels and like continuing franchises specifically? Because I know you did the first Escape Room and the second, but then you came in on the fourth Insidious movie. So how different was that to kind of creating continuity, but also something unique within an existing series of films?
Yeah, great question. I mean, look, Insidious was a challenge. It was, I equate my Insidious job as sort of like a director for hire, like on a TV show, where I'm coming in
Okay.
as a steward of a universe that's already been established.
Mhm.
And so, you know, it's more about upholding what James and Lee had done before. And, you know, I think my biggest contribution was early in the process when I was auditioning for the job. Lee had written a script, and it didn't have a demon in it, and he had all these amazing images of locks and keys and prisons. And I said, you know, when I think of Insidious, I think of the lipstick demon. I think, you know, it's a little giallo. It has a really cool iconic entity. And so I had my concept artist do this image of the of Keyface, and it was like a muzzle shot, a gunshot wound to the face, where it looked like a keyhole in his mouth. And I remember on the day, like, oh, I could see Jason Blum going, oh, that's really cool, like, you know. And he had keys for fingers. And what's really funny is once I found I got the job, like months later, a new script came and it had Key Face throughout a lot of it. It's like so it was like, but to answer your question, Lee was amazing. James Wan he's such a master at it. Like you're not going to outwan the Wan in terms of like supernatural scares. Just you
Yeah.
can't. Like the guy is he's just on a different level in terms of the construction of scares. So, and Lynn was a good friend. So it was really fun to kind of, and the biggest thing I learned was like, I had 20 days on Taking of Deborah Logan. On Insidious, I had 30. And I thought, oh my God, I have all this time. Like, I'm going to do all these cool stuff. And then, I remember my AD coming in and like ripping my shot list in half. Like, it was just like, no, dude, yeah. And so you learn, but like little things like Lynn Shaye's character touching a doorknob and flying back across the room, like that takes half a day. You got to get the stunt riggers in there, and you got to rehearse it and make it safe. And so it was a steep learning curve. But I had great professional technicians around me, and Lee was just great. He was such a supportive kind of, he's in the movie. He was kind of, but he really was generous, and I learned a lot from him. And then Escape Room was a big jump forward for me because it was my own sandbox, and I got to really design the movie from the ground up. And it was a little budget, but it was a big movie wrapped in a little budget. And so we shot it in South Africa. I had an amazing DP and production designer, and the billiard room, I mean, I can't even tell you how complicated that was to shoot in terms of everything's on wires. It's a massive fishbowl. It's up 7 feet off the ground. We pull floor panels away to reveal the green screen. So it had more visual effects shots than Venom did that year.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. But I just jumped in the deep end, and I learned visual effects, and I learned how to prep it properly and to really utilize tools and prep to pre-visualize. And we were using Screen Engine kind of visual previs techniques. And so it was just great, and and then Escape Room 2, I mean, I ended up derailing a New York City subway car. And, so I feel like the bag of tricks is expanded, but it always comes down to, how do you tell a good story? What is the character relationships? What is the heart of the movie? If you can protect that, and, oh, by the way, give them crazy, beaches that swallow people whole, then you're in it,
That's awesome. So, what is your favorite, or do you have a favorite kill from Escape Room, or a moment that you were most impressed with that you were able to pull off in either film?
Yeah, I mean, I really am proud of the billiard room because it worked like a Swiss Army knife, and Deborah Ann Wall, falling through the floor, like it was so complicated, and to get all those bits and pieces to get it to work properly, and initially production told me that it was unproducible,
Oh,
and
really?
but we really figured out a way, scrappy filmmaking. So I'd say that's definitely the crowning achievement. Look, the escape room movies are a bit bubblegum for me. They don't have that much depth, and I think that's my one complaint about them, is that they are what they are. You know what I mean? They're a B movie in a sort of a nice shiny wrapper.
Yeah.
But what was also cool was, frankly, our producers said, look, we don't want to make, this is a PG-13 movie, so I had to rely on suspense over gore, and and suspense over shock. And it was just fun to kind of play in that sandbox, that so the producers could show their kids the movie and not have, because there's been the versions where in Cube, and a guy getting vivisected and stuff, and so that wasn't this. And so
Yeah.
it's not, a lot of hardcore horror fans think it's maybe a little light or a little cheesy, but that was the directive I was given.
It's fun.
Yeah, it's fun, and I love strong female leads, and
Yeah.
the idea of this mousy little college girl who's really smart, who outfoxes the fox, was always fun.
Yeah. And so, I mean, what do you want to do next? Like, what kind of project would you love to work on next?
Well, I've been working for the last 2 years on a passion project for Netflix. It's a series. It is a series that it's a genre show that Darren Aronofsky and Protozoa are producing.
Oh,
And
wow.
I'm crazy proud of it. It's sort of it deals with addiction in a really, really it's the closest I've gotten to Deborah Logan in terms of taking a real world fear and then turning it on its head. It's deeply personal. We wrote the whole season. I literally have my final visual presentation next week. And we'll see. It's a really ambitious show. There's a lot of scope. There's a lot of action. And they seem excited about it, but it could go either way because of just the nature of the business right now. So we'll see. And if that doesn't come together, I'll probably join a monastery and just give my life to Jesus.
Oh, cool. Okay, I like that. I like that backup plan.
Yeah.
And then my final question for you is, we talked about franchises and series. If there was any other horror franchise that you could work on, which franchise would you pick?
Oh, well, I'm flirting with one right now that I can't talk about, but outside of that, what other franchise would be fun?
Flirting with one.
Uh,
I like that.
yeah, hmm. It's tough. I mean, having I want to do originals, and that's
Okay,
where that's
yeah,
where my mind is at right now.
cool.
Look, I'll never say never. It'd be interesting to do a poltergeist movie, but it's hard to even say that out loud and not just feel the weight of what came before. And
Yeah,
so I take that very seriously. But
yeah,
I'll circle back to you on that.
cool.
Yeah. And in terms of the horror crowd, I watched it. It's very heartwarming, and I think that horror fans are really gonna get an inside look at that we're real people and that we're flawed and that we're scared, and I think the documentary really presents a kind of a haven for the misfits and the weirdos, and I've felt so included in this group. And I'm not somebody who goes around wearing black, and I do CrossFit and go to the beach, and I'm like a weird kind of horror lover that doesn't fit the type.
Yeah.
But I've always just felt like, talking to you, I feel like I've known you my whole life, and it's just that weird kismet, that we definitely, we're well-adjusted weirdos, I guess would be the way
That
I
is the
would
best
put
way
it.
to put it. And documentary, I think I love that it makes I think it takes away this illusion that filmmakers are like otherworldly. Like we're all just people who are trying to, and like journalists, like we're all just loving horror and trying to make it work. And we all just kind of all hang out as a weird little group and find love and friendship in that group. And it's
That's
nice to
very
see that on
true.
screen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, Adam, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with
It's
me
my pleasure.
today.